uh, when nuclear power, which I thought was a very good way to avoid CO2 emissions, was proven to be very dangerous in Japan. And I thought I need to look deeper into energy security. And I teach on a large variety of topics, but I have to say that energy security is my favorite because it is very, very interesting. And so I'm going to take about 20 minutes to go through what I think are the key things I want you to take away from this. There's a little bit of overlap with Dr. Bahgat, and I apologize for that. I'll skim through those pieces. He and I largely agree on many things. But this is what I want to talk. Omar had asked me to talk about the state of the field. And then I want to get into the complexity issue and the feedback loops in energy and how that plays out in various ways. I'm going to talk a little bit about health and security and energy security as well. And we'll talk about renewables and go into discussion. So we've already heard on the International Energy Agency's views on energy security. This is a definition you can get at their website. I would take issue with the word uninterrupted. I think that reliable availability is a better way to say it. There will be interruptions, and I want to talk about how those play out because it's a little bit different in my observation than is often seen. So as a field, I think that energy security is not like international relations or comparative studies as a field in social science. It's a very multi-dimensional concept and topic, but it's looked at usually in a fragmented way. For example, prior to 2011, my focus on energy security as a field of study was heavily into these kinds of things, the geopolitical lines of communication and the potential interruption of those lines of communication and their effect on national security because of a cutoff of energy supplies. And you can see two examples of critical sea lines of communication, one in your region, the Straits of Hormuz, and another in my region, the Straits of Malacca. What I have come to understand, however, is that those choke points are less critical than I used to think in the longer term. In the short term, they are very critical, but in the longer term, maybe not so dramatic. And I'll get into that in a little bit. Another aspect of energy security is the amazing technology that goes into it. Graph on the left there is the Deepwater Horizon well, or the Macondo well that was drilled by the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig. And there was obviously an accident incident there, a huge release of oil contamination to the environment, not as harmful as we initially feared it might be, thankfully. But I want to highlight that this well, over 10,000 feet in depth, and they drilled two wells to the side of it to cut it off. So the technology in energy security is really amazing. And one way that plays out is which companies have access to that kind of technology and which don't. In the field of oil drilling, for example, the Russian oil reserves in their Far East, which are very rough climatic conditions, relies heavily on technology from Western oil companies that they don't have. And I think that we'll see in the coming years the impact of the Ukraine war on that oil production from Russia as a result of that. Not in the short term, however. Another aspect of energy security is the deep investments that it requires. This is a map from Al Jazeera of pipelines, oil and gas pipelines throughout the world. And all of these pipelines represent billions and billions and billions of dollars of investment, in addition to all the other aspects of the energy infrastructure, which also add up to billions and billions. And so another concept that I think is important as security practitioners when we think about energy security is to understand the economic cycle of the payback of those. For example, in the United States today, or I should say before the last election, late last year, the price of oil had gone up, partly because of the Russian invasion. And the president of the United States, Joe Biden, was demanding essentially that oil companies in the United States drill for more oil and gas, and they weren't doing that. And the reason they weren't doing that wasn't because they wanted Joe Biden to be angry, and it wasn't because they didn't want to make money. It was because investing in new drilling for oil and gas, they had to predict, okay, is this investment going to pay out over the next 10 to 20 years, which is the investment payback time frame? And I think many of them assess that given some of the factors that Dr. Bahgat talked about earlier and some that I'll talk about later, that the reliability of that payback was not great. And so we need to keep that in mind. With regard to climate change, for example, right now we see countries around the world, in particular in Asia Pacific and my part of the world, that are building coal-fired power plants to meet energy demand. Now, it's a very logical thing to do, but the payback for a lot of those plants is 20 years. And I'm not sure I believe those assets are going to become stranded because of the technological revolution we are seeing with regard to climate change, or not climate change, renewable energy. So that's another aspect of energy security, doesn't often get thought of. And finally, there's regulation and government activity. The Nuclear Regulatory Agency, for example, in the United States, is essential to the operation of nuclear power in the United States. And it's a very dangerous technology. It must be, adequately regulated. Even with adequate regulation, however, in the case of nuclear power, it's not cost effective in the United States because of public hostility towards nuclear power. Without government regulation, it wouldn't be possible at all. And on the right, you can see that recently the US Congress passed legislation we call the Inflation Reduction Act, but it is a huge bill designed to spur innovation and investment in renewable and green energy into the future. And so we have to think about the government regulation and how that plays out too. And there's a lot of other components to government regulation. And the challenge is that government regulations, they are slow moving. They don't adapt as quickly as they need to do. We need them, but we need to make them more adaptable. So those are just 4 areas that compromise parts of the energy security picture. There are others. So the field of study is a little bit disjointed. We have to try and bring that together. And so I'd like to think of it as a holistic thing. So there's one global energy system. It involves oil and gas, and nuclear and coal and renewables and hydro, and maybe hydrogen down the future, and maybe fusion down the future. It has a lot of nonlinear feedback loops that we don't think about, and many externalities. It's an economics term for something you're not really paying for. Many externalities, particularly with regard to health security, are not accounted for, and that leads to a lower level of energy security and societal security for a variety of reasons. I'm going to try and get that holistic awareness on the issue. Energy is a feedback loop. We will never run out of oil, right? Oil consumption goes up, the supply goes down, and the price goes up, and then the price goes up and consumption goes down, and then the supply goes up. And so this is a constant cycle, and oil represents one aspect of it, but it's true for all energy forms. And you can see from this graph going back to 1861, the price of oil goes up and down, as do the prices of all commodities. And so when the price goes up, people seek alternatives, and then they also seek greater supply, and then the price goes back down. I love this slide on proven oil reserves from 2011 until a couple of years ago. These are the top 10 countries of proven oil reserves. And as you can see, over a 10-year period, the proven oil reserves increased by almost 20%, even as we consumed 340 billion barrels of oil on average over that period of time. And that is proven traditional oil reserves. As prices go up, we look for untraditional or non-traditional reserves. For example, the General Accountability Office of the U.S. government a number of years ago assessed a tremendous supply of oil in what's called oil shale in just a few states in the United States alone. The fracking revolution we've seen over the last 10 years is another example of this. So we're not going to run out of these reserves, but we do need to be mindful of the effects they have. Getting back to feedback loops, Russian invasion of Ukraine, a dramatic event, Russia, major oil and gas supplier around the world, major efforts by Western countries, leading economies to cut off the supply of Russian oil so that they cannot fund their war. And as this graph from The Economist just a week or two ago shows, their crude oil exports have not really declined. They've shifted their customers. There are reports that their crude is selling at a significant discount to Brent, but I suspect that those numbers are probably not 100% accurate. And what we see is an increasing fleet of shadow tankers that are able to bring Russian oil to markets outside of the West. And so, again, global energy system, and it's got a lot of feedback loops. And so cutting off Russian oil supplies as much as we may try is probably not going to ultimately be that effective. It might be effective if we had 100% global agreement on that, but even then it would be difficult. So physical security is one component, and you can think of geopolitics. We just talked about that. You can think about cybersecurity, and you can think about citizen safety. Let's look at each of those in turn. Those choke points are important, but here's what I want to say about choke points. If the choke points are blocked, that feedback loop kicks in again. The price of oil spikes, and in the short term, it can be very economically painful. But if the cutoff lasts for a significant period of time, alternative ways to move that oil or gas or whatever it is will be discovered, and alternative supplies will come online. So oil choke points are an important thing, and in the short run, they can be very significant. And some countries have particular vulnerabilities to these choke points that the globe as a whole does not have. But ultimately, I think that we shouldn't focus too much energy on that. Cybersecurity warrants more attention. We've seen a couple of cyber attacks that have not yet caused significant disruption. The most recent one was apparently a Russian attack on the U.S. energy grid that occurred as a result of the war in Ukraine and U.S. support for Ukraine. And reporting coming out recently is very sparse. The data is not very detailed, but apparently there was a much more significant attempt by Russia to hack our energy grid in the United States than was widely known. And apparently the defenses of the United States prevailed in this case. But increasingly going forward, cybersecurity is a huge part of this physical security of our energy systems. The previous speaker was talking about health security, and I think that's a component of energy security that we really don't pay attention to. So the picture on the left is Beijing on a clear day when the wind's blowing a certain direction. Picture on the right is Beijing on most days. And so a woman, Chinese journalist, released a film called Under the Dome, which was an investigative look at pollution in China. And that was a very interesting review. If you're interested in the subject, I recommend you look it up on Google, on YouTube. The estimated number of Chinese citizens who die prematurely each year from respiratory conditions related to air pollution is up towards 1 million citizens. Let me repeat that. As many as 1 million Chinese citizens are dying prematurely every year because of air pollution alone. Now, this next slide, I think, is another important one to keep in mind, because whatever source of energy we use, there is some mortality risk due to burning it, due to transporting it, due to whatever. And so this is a rough chart from 10 years ago, and it's a hard thing to measure. I wouldn't put a lot of money on the individual numbers as specifics, more about comparative. So as you can see, coal, particularly coal in China, the highest number of mortality deaths per trillion kilowatt hours of electricity generated. Nuclear is the safest, and I would encourage the world to move further towards nuclear energy to offset these climate change risks as well as the other health security risks. But it needs to be done in a very carefully regulated way because, as we saw with Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and Fukushima, there is still a chance for catastrophe. So I should also add that, global climate change poses significant risks, but it's the air pollution from nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide that's killing people in China right now. Mercury released from the burning of coal is polluting the waterways in the United States and globally as well. So there's a lot of aspects to the health security side of energy production and consumption. Now, the good news is we are in the midst of a renewable revolution. And I personally believe that the international estimates on how quickly we can move to a green economy are off based on technology. There are some uncertainties, and I don't want to sound Pollyannish, but the trajectories are quite dramatic. The Tony Seba has put out a couple of papers and talks talking about this solar wind battery revolution we're in as the prices come down. And the price declines are very dramatic. So as you can see from this slide, the unsubsidized cost of solar power has declined down below the unsubsidized cost of fossil fuels. And wind is very close as well. This has been a dramatic shift over the last 10 to 15 years. And the challenge for wind and solar, of course, is that they are, what's the term I'm looking for? The sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. So we need some kind of storage mechanism to go along with that. And that's been a challenge. But similarly, battery costs and weight per energy unit have also declined dramatically, 89% in the last 10 to 12 years. And so if this technological trend continues, we will see a situation where we will achieve much more success against fossil fuel emissions and CO2 problem globally than we could have ever hoped. And I should point out that I am very pessimistic for international efforts to agree on carbon reductions. Like, I just don't think we will be able to generate the political will. COP26 in Scotland, COP27 in Egypt, these are mass gatherings and people are trying really hard, but ultimately there's just no political will to sustain the costs associated with cutting fossil fuel consumption, and there's no political will to agree on who should pay these costs. And so I'm very pessimistic on government action to address CO2 emissions, but I'm very optimistic with regard to the technology and innovation to achieve this much quicker. And the US's Inflation Reduction Act, which I already mentioned, is really a shot in the arm, a dramatic shot in the arm globally to speed this movement forward. I would like to mention, Dr. Bahgat mentioned that China is producing the majority of these renewable energies, which is absolutely true. They have 60 to 80% of market share for a lot of the base materials that go into solar panels and wind turbines, and they manufacture a lot of them as well. The good news is, however, that again, energy is a feedback loop. So if China were to cut off or impose severe tariffs or whatever on its sales of these technologies, in the very short term, wouldn't hurt us too bad because we're still generating the energy we already have. We still have our supplies of natural gas and oil that we're buying until we surpass the need for those. And if we don't get a cut, if we can't put in new windmills for next year, that's okay. I mean, it's maybe a minor economic hit, probably not, but ultimately, were they to do that, then other producers will come online in other areas. And there's a lot more to that equation that we can talk about in Q&A, but I'm just
sorry, Bill,
time.
I'm just interrupting you. You have 2 minutes to wrap it up.
Yes, no, I have one more slide. Thank you. So just the last data point, electric cars are cool. I have a Tesla myself. And Tesla has moved into first place in the largest car market in the United States and one of the leading car markets in the world, and that's California, where their two cars, the Model Y and the Model 3, are the top selling cars, and they're crushing the number 2 cars produced by Toyota. So I think we're going to see an acceleration in the uptake of these vehicles. So in the end, try to think of energy security as very much a feedback loop, very holistic. There's a lot of variables going into it. And thank you again for allowing me to be a part of this panel. And I look forward to the discussion afterwards. Aloha.
Thank you, Bill, for that optimistic notes that we're ending this session. And also for the sake of time, I think our speakers were strict on times. Nobody went a minute over or minutes below. Now we have about 30 minutes to take questions. Okay, go ahead, Dr.
Thank you so much. Very interesting and thought-provoking presentations. My name is Ahmed Badran, and I'm the head of the International Affairs Department at Qatar University. 2 quick questions to Professor Gawdat and to Bill on the energy security and the energy transition, particularly in the Gulf area. I have just concluded this project looking into modeling transition in the GCC countries with a special focus on Qatar, and it was funded by QNRF here in Qatar. And in the project, we have looked at different issues related to the energy transition, and I think some of those issues need to be considered when we talk about energy security in the region. The first issue is basically to deal with the amount of unburnable fuel that has to be stayed in the ground in the GCC countries if they want to reach the Paris Agreement goals and targets. So this estimate is about like 50% of what they have at the moment. It would be unburnable. And having said that, I think Bill has referred to this as well when he was talking about the billions of dollars that have been already invested in the current physical infrastructure to extract and to export oil and gas in the region. So having those two issues at mind, don't you think that we need to come up with a fair burden sharing system, for example, in which those GCC countries have to be compensated for these sort of like long-term investments that they have made in the physical infrastructure and for the oil and gas that will not be extracted and will stay in the ground? So this is the first point. My second point is to deal with the issue of subsidies in the energy sector. And this is one of the critical and spiky issues when we consider the case of the GCC countries. So for example, and of course, you know that this, so having those sort of like heavy subsidies directed towards fuel, it actually encourages people to consume more and more fuel. And this has its own impact as well on the amount of CO2 that those countries produce and send into air. So, but again, addressing this issue is not an easy task for the GCC governments, because this is part of the social contract, and it will heavily affect the notion of energy security in the region. So it's not an easy way, there is no like an easy, clear-cut answer to this question. How can we deal with subsidies in the GCC region? Finally, you've mentioned, Professor Gawdat, in your presentation, the issue of Ukraine. And this actually has brought to my mind a very interesting point with regard to how serious the discourse is about clean energy, taking account of the fact that countries like Germany, for example, as a result of the war in Ukraine, they went back to use some of the coal power plants, for example. So this actually raises a question about how serious those countries are, the developed countries are, when it comes to the issue of using clean energy to address climate change. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I don't want to be invisible for other people. My name is Maria Zolkin. I'm a researcher from London School of Economics, International Relations Department, and also I'm a head of regional security at Ukrainian think tank, Democratic Initiatives Foundation. I have a question regarding weaponization of energy, and it is actually the follow-up or a part of the last question, because mainly we were speaking about producing and looking at the energy security from the position of countries producing or consuming energy in terms of peaceful times. But when it comes to specific situations like Russian strategy towards Ukraine, towards European countries, this is the case, in my opinion, of harming energy security of those countries. For these reasons, Ukraine has already had, before the large-scale invasion, several so-called gas wars with Russia, when Russia simply cut the supplies in order to make a political deal. It was at the end of 2000s, for instance. There were no sanctions on gas from the European Union after large-scale invasion of Russia. Russia cut its supplies to European Union itself, again, waiting that there will be a political reply, I don't know, deal, less of support to Ukraine, whatever. So what to do with that in terms of ability of weaponize actually any kind of energy? And atomic energy is not, from this point of view, is not a different case. For instance, because the main Russian state atomic energy, Rosatom, is a partner, is actually constructor of several important atomic stations around developed countries like France, Hungary, Turkey. So what to do with the weaponization of the energy in these cases?
Thank you very much. My name is Hassan Barari from Qatar University. I actually have probably the same comment or the same question about the weaponization of oil. It was not the first time. And during the war, in October War 1973, the Arabs weaponized oil, and the Americans stepped in immediately, and they restabled the whole market. I mean, is there a chance for, I don't know who, someone in the, I know who called the shots at the international system these days, but could the American, for instance, stepped in the war in Ukraine and deal with this issue and deprive Russia from, you know, destabilizing the market furthermore? Because now it's obvious that Europeans been dependent on Russia, and they probably don't have the horizon to get out of this dependency soon. This is one thing. And second thing is about the Arab scene, because you talked about the GCC, but there are some Arab countries that depending on the GCC in terms of providing them with all kind of oil and energy. And these days we are actually reading in the press about Jordanians, Iraqi, Egyptian kind of what they call electric integration or connection. I don't know what they call it, the technical name for that. But do you think that, you know, this is really is achievable, is doable, given the fact that, you know, given the geostrategic changes in the region? Thank you very much.
Just a slightly different track to question on the weaponization of the medical system. My name's Hamish de Bretton-Gordon from Cambridge University. Really focused at you, Karim. We saw the medical system being directly targeted in Syria by the regime and by the Russians. We're seeing exactly the same tactic being used in Ukraine by the Russians. Is there anything that we learnt in Syria that is applicable to what's happening in Ukraine at the moment?
Okay, first of all, thank you for your lecture. It was really insightful for you, and I'd like to thank you for being here. My first question is for Mr. Gawdat. Consider the Ukrainian war with Russia and how it affects the European region regarding energy imports from Russia and cutting them out because of the war. Can China be the wild card for Europe and end their insecurity of energy? And continuing on my first question, my second question is for Mr. Bell. As we can see that the Russian strategy in this war is using energy security as a threat weapon on Europe countries. And since China is considering, according to many reports, that they will support European countries with oil supplies, how can China's support for European countries can affect its oil trading and with Russia, and is there a chance for decreasing in Russia oil trading with China? And another question is that how can this decrease in imports between these countries can affect Russian economy? Thank you.
All right. Okay, there is two people that have. Okay, there's two hands. Only two hands. All right. So okay, get those two hands, please. If you have a comment, make it brief, so that we could give a time to the speakers to respond, so that we can get close on time. I will close it on time.
السلام عليكم. أنا بشاير الدوسري طالبة في مركز الدوحة في الدراسات النقدية. أنا أوجه سؤالي تحديداً للدكتور جودة بهجت. تحدث عن مؤتمر المناخ ومسارعة الرئيس بايدن في العودة لاتفاقية المناخ فور وصوله لسدة الحكم. بالنسبة للسؤال الأول، كيف يسهم الطلب الأمريكي لدول الخليج بزيادة إنتاجها من النفط مؤخراً إيجابياً في مؤتمرات المناخ؟ أما بالنسبة للسؤال الثاني، فما مدى فعالية وإلزامية مؤتمرات المناخ في ظل السباق الأوروبي نحو الوقود الأحفوري بمختلف مشتقاتها في أفريقيا؟ ولماذا لم تصرف أوروبا ملياراتها في الطاقة المتجددة؟
The fossil fuel from Africa, and why didn't they invest in renewables instead of rushing to buy more fossil fuel based energy supplies from Africa?
for your presentations. I just had a question for Dr. Abdulkarim regarding health security, more specifically in the case of Qatar, but I think it applies for majority of the GCC states anyways. Obviously, the population size of the nationals in Qatar is quite low, and so in the health service in itself, from statistics that I've read before, around 96% of the nurses are foreign or expats, and about 69% of the doctors also are foreigners. So in regards to potential transitions in Qatar's, for example, energy with potential fluctuations to maybe its economy as a regards to that, there's a lot of instability regards to these foreign workers and their capacity to basically at any point leave, and which leaves Qatar and other GCC states that are also extremely dependent on these expat medical workers. It leaves it vulnerable to the possibility of these people all leaving at once. So my question more so is, how in the future can a country like Qatar maintain or protect its health services from these potential fluctuations or potential crisis of that sort? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Because we're supposed to end this session at 4:20, so this is 4:03. I'll give our colleagues, I'll give you 4 minutes for each. And so I'll start with Bill. Bill, you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, so go ahead.
4 minutes. Okay, a lot of great comments and questions there. Let me try and hit a couple key ones. The first questioner asked about burden sharing and stranded assets and subsidies in the Middle East region. So I don't think we're going to find any political will for any kind of burden sharing to keep that oil and gas from being extracted and burned. As I said, the COPE process, there's just not the political will for that. The subsidies will continue, and fortunately, the economies of this region are not so big, and the population is not so big that even though those hydrocarbons will continue to be burned for the foreseeable future, even in the face of this renewable revolution, it won't be as destructive as if China were doing that. And the interesting thing is that those assets will keep producing for their lifetime. And if it's not economical, then bankruptcy will be declared, they'll be reallocated to other companies, and they'll be producing at a lower cost. The good news for those that do rely heavily on hydrocarbon extraction is hydrocarbons are still used extensively in other industrial parts of the economy, for example, the production of plastics. And although I don't agree with these assessments, there are some commentators who believe that the demand for hydrocarbons for plastics and other industrial uses will be so high in the coming years that they will continue to be extracted even in the face of electrification of the transport sector. On the weaponization of oil and Russia, so the European Union basically made a deal with Russia to get very inexpensive supplies of natural gas, which powered their economy. And you could say it was a deal with the devil today, but it was also believed by many at the time that interdependence would kick in, and as a result of this connection, Russian reliance on Europeans to sell their oil and European reliance on the Russians to buy the oil, that there wouldn't be conflict. Unfortunately, the theory of interdependence has taken a major hit as a result of this conflict. The Europeans really didn't have an option to go to renewables yet on the scale they needed to in the short term, which is why they kept some coal power plants open. Interestingly enough, in Germany, there's a very hostile attitude toward nuclear weapons, and they barely mustered the political will to keep those nuclear power plants open for the rest of this year. And even now, with the situation, they're slated to close them in April in 2 months, which doesn't make any sense from an energy security or an environmental security perspective, if you ask me. In the longer term, however, I do think that the Ukraine war will dramatically speed the transition to renewables, because there's still a great deal of political will in Europe to do that. The last point I'll make is on the PRC support for Europe. China doesn't really have much oil. They import the vast majority of their oil, so they won't be able to do that. China is wary of becoming dependent on Russian oil. So right now there's a big debate about building a pipeline from Russia to China to supply oil and natural gas. And the Chinese are interested in it for a small amount of their needs, but they have no desire to become dependent on Russia the way the Europeans did, because they can see the writing on the wall. And there's a lot more I could cover, but I think I've used my 4 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Abdulkarim.
Yeah, so changing to health security. So the first question, which is what we can learn really from the attacks on healthcare in Syria. And actually, this is really one of the issues to highlight, that we need to learn from the current conflicts, because conflicts are becoming more urbanized, the casualties of civilians are becoming more and more. So what we can learn from Syria, first, how to report attacks on healthcare. The only international reporting system on attacks on healthcare started in 2018, which is called Surveillance System for Attacks, led by the WHO. And there are a lot of shortages in this system because it's not linked to accountability, which is the second point on documentation and accountability, having international mechanisms for accountability when it comes to attacks on healthcare. The third issue related to protection of health workers. And these range from like fortification of health facilities in times of conflict, and also changing the design of humanitarian interventions to cope with the increased security threat. And lastly, the use of technology. For example, the HALA system, and Hamish, you were involved in this HALA system, which I think is one of the innovative approach of using different air sensors and different artificial intelligence to predict airstrikes and then to warn health facilities so they can be evacuated. The second question, which is really important about population size and how different health systems, they are dependent on foreign health workforce. And I think the example of the UK after Brexit is a clear example. That after the Brexit, a lot of European health workforce left the UK, and this left a lot of shortages within the NHS. Especially this is coupled with the COVID-19. Now the backlog, the waiting time, there are 7.2 million people in the UK waiting for treatments, which is almost 7 or 8% of the whole population. So I think this is sometimes unavoidable, but the only issue is to plan ahead, having clear policy on really first planning for health security threats, and also investment in medical education, national forces in medical education. And lastly, I think improving the conditions of foreign health workers, that could be an investment for the same country if they were given the right, the proper rights, so they can stay in the country and contribute to the investment in the long term in the health systems.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, Dr. Gawdat.
Thank you, and I'm standing between you and ending the day, so I will try to be very brief with final thoughts. In every oil conference I attend, somebody quotes Ahmad Zaki Yamani, and so far nobody, so I will. Ahmad Zaki Yamani said the Stone Age ended not because the world ran out of stone, but because better source of energy was discovered, and probably the same thing will happen to oil. But I still not sure that oil era is coming to an end. Not only plastic fertilizers and other things are made out of oil, but also there is a great advance in electric cars, but very little in electric aeroplanes. Still, we need oil at least for our lifetime. For Russia, Russia lost its reputation as reliable source of energy. This is very, very important thing for Russia. Europe will never be as dependent on Russia's oil and gas as it was before the war in Ukraine. Russia lost it for good. This is very important. For subsidies, you have to change the culture, and it takes a very long time to change the culture. Most people in the Gulf, for good reasons, believe it is their birthright to consume as much oil and gas as they want. When you are in Qatar with all this gas, in Saudi Arabia with all this oil, you feel it is your right. For stranded resources, it is, as very much Bill said, American oil companies have not invested in producing more oil, even with prices are very high, because they see the writing on the wall. They see more restrictions on oil production. So there is a move away from this. I do not believe there will be any compensation for oil-producing countries. In the West, no politician can convince taxpayer money to give the money to Saudi Arabia, to any oil-producing country to reduce pollution or reduce production. The same thing about democracy, why Europe has not invested enough in clean energy. In every democratic country, politicians think about the next election. What I know in Europe, European governments are telling their people, you have to take shower only for 2 minutes. Streets are dark in the evening to reduce oil energy consumption. There is balance between moving very fast in clean energy and meeting the population's energy needs. This is why Germany came to Qatar begging for gas, because German leaders need gas today. Clean energy is not ready yet. Very dangerous in Ukraine, the attack on nuclear facilities. This is very important because this is a huge security challenge. United States, Biden administration is trying to reduce pollution at home, but at the same time begging OPEC countries to increase production. There's this contradiction because pollution does not recognize political borders. You cannot reduce pollution at home and beg Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing countries to increase production. Europe and European countries have been trying to replace Russia's oil and gas by coming to Qatar here, by agreeing with Algeria, Azerbaijan, trying to find other sources. One very important strategic development which did not get enough attention, the maritime border agreement between Lebanon and Israel. United States and Europe worked very hard to facilitate this agreement. Europe needs gas from Mediterranean Sea, and Biden administration invested heavily in this agreement. My last point about China, not only China and India are getting a great discount from Russia. They are benefiting from Ukraine war. Russia cannot export gas to Europe, and Russia has succeeded in switching to Asia, and China and India are taking advantage of this. Thank you.
شكرا جزيل. شكر للزملاء في هذه الجلسة، ولا يسعنا في ختام هذه الجلسة إلا وأن نشكر الإخوة في
Thank our colleagues from the Strategic Studies Unit and all our guests and all our participants. Thank you very much.